There is a version of you that has already lost. He wakes up every morning apologizing for existing. He shrinks in rooms where he should expand. He laughs at jokes made at his expense because he fears the silence that would follow if he didn't. He says yes when every bone in his body screams no. He waits for permission, for approval, for the right moment that never seems to arrive. He is polite to people who disrespect him and generous to people who take without giving. He mistakes suffering for virtue and calls his cowardice patience. He has been told, all his life, that these qualities make him a good man. And he has believed it. And it has cost him everything. This document is not for him. This document is written for the man he could become if he is willing to do what most people spend a lifetime avoiding, look directly into the face of his own weakness and destroy it before the world does it for him. Niccolò Machiavelli wrote The Prince in 1513, exiled, broken, and desperate. He had served Florence for 14 years as a senior official, navigating wars, diplomacy, and political catastrophe with extraordinary intelligence. Then, the Medici returned to power, and he was stripped of everything, his position, his reputation, eventually his freedom. He was tortured. And, in the aftermath of that destruction, sitting in a small house in the Tuscan countryside, he wrote one of the most dangerous, honest, and enduring documents in human history. He did not write it as a moralist. He did not write it as an idealist. He wrote it as a man who had watched the world operate according to its real rules, not the rules that people pretend govern it, and he recorded what he saw without flinching. The lessons in this document are drawn from that tradition, from Machiavelli, yes, but also from the long, brutal history of men and women who understood power, survived when others didn't, and transformed their lives not by being better people in the conventional sense, but by being more honest with themselves than almost anyone around them dared to be. These are lessons most people learn too late, usually after a great defeat, after the career collapse, after the betrayal, after the years wasted waiting for someone to recognize their worth, after the relationship destroyed by passivity, after the opportunity lost to hesitation. The goal here is that you learn them now, before the losses come, or at least before the next one. Each lesson is a stone in a wall. Build the wall. Because the man who destroys his weak self first cannot be destroyed by anyone else after. Part 1, The Architecture of Self-Destruction and Why Most Men Participate in It Willingly. The first thing you must understand, and this is the foundation upon which everything else rests, is that weakness is not something that happens to you. It is something you choose, repeatedly, over years, until the choosing becomes so automatic that it no longer feels like a choice at all. It feels like your personality. It feels like who you are. And that is the most dangerous moment in any man's life, when he stops distinguishing between what he has practiced and what he fundamentally is. Most people spend their entire lives in that confusion. Lesson 1: Most people are not against you, they are simply for themselves, and you must become the same. The world operates on a principle so simple that children understand it before adults teach them not to. Every living creature, in every moment, is pursuing its own survival and advantage. This is not cynicism. This is biology. This is history. This is every negotiation, every war, every friendship, every marriage that has ever existed on this earth. The great tragedy is that somewhere between childhood and adulthood, most people are socialized into believing that acknowledging this truth makes them a bad person. They are taught that thinking about their own interests is selfish, and that selfishness is the great moral failing. So they suppress the instinct. They perform selflessness. They give when they should protect. They accommodate when they should assert. They call it generosity, and sometimes it is. But, often, far more often than they admit, it is fear dressed in a noble costume. Machiavelli understood this with cold precision. He wrote that a man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must inevitably come to grief among so many who are not good. He did not say this to encourage cruelty. He said it to encourage honesty. The world contains people who will use your goodness against you. Not all of them. Not even most of them. But enough of them that if you go through life without understanding this, you will eventually be used by one of them in a way you cannot recover from easily. The first lesson of the Machiavellian code is not to become selfish in a petty, small-minded way. It is to become sovereign over your own interests, to understand clearly what you want, what you are willing to sacrifice for it, and what you are not willing to sacrifice at all. This is the foundation of all strategy, all negotiation, all power. A man who does not know what he wants cannot protect it. A man who does not protect his interests will find that others fill the vacuum, and they will not be as gentle with those interests as he was. Begin here. Before you read another word, ask yourself honestly, in the last month, how many times did you act against your own clear interests in order to be liked, to avoid conflict, or to maintain a peace that you were the only one maintaining? How many times did you say yes when the honest answer was no? How many times did you give something time, energy, money, attention, not because you genuinely wanted to, but because you were afraid of what would happen if you didn't? That fear, that specific, quiet, grinding fear, is the architecture of your weakness. And it was built brick by brick, over years, by your own hand. Lesson 2: the kindness that costs you nothing is worth nothing, and the kindness that costs you everything destroys you. There is a distinction that almost no one makes clearly enough, and it is the distinction between genuine generosity and compulsive accommodation. Genuine generosity comes from strength. It is the act of a man who has enough resources, enough confidence, enough self-respect that he can give freely without resentment and without expectation. It costs him something real, and he pays it willingly, and he does not keep a ledger. This kind of generosity is a virtue in the truest sense. It builds real relationships. It creates loyalty. It generates the kind of goodwill that returns to you in ways you never anticipated. Compulsive accommodation is something else entirely. It comes from fear. It is the act of a man who gives not because he has abundance, but because he is terrified of what happens if he doesn't. He gives his time to people who waste it because he is afraid they will think badly of him if he doesn't. He agrees with opinions he finds absurd because he is afraid of the discomfort that disagreement creates. He tolerates disrespect because the confrontation required to stop it feels more dangerous than the disrespect itself. He calls this kindness. He calls it being a good person. And the people around him, consciously or not, recognize it for exactly what it is: a soft target. An open door. A resource that can be drawn on without limit because there will be no consequence. Machiavelli wrote that it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. This has been quoted endlessly and almost always misunderstood. He was not advocating cruelty or tyranny. He was making a precise observation about what creates reliable behavior in others. Love, as he understood it in political terms, is conditional. It exists as long as it is convenient, as long as the man who generates it continues to provide whatever it was that earned the love. The moment circumstances change, love evaporates. Fear, the specific, healthy kind of fear that comes from knowing a man has limits and will enforce them, creates a more stable dynamic, because it operates regardless of convenience. A man who never faces consequences teaches the people around him that there are no consequences. And people, being what they are, will eventually take advantage of that lesson. This does not mean you should be cold, or harsh, or unkind. It means you should be real. Real with yourself about what you will and will not accept. Real with others about the same. The man who destroys his weak self does not do it by becoming cruel. He does it by becoming honest, first with himself, which is always the hardest place to start. Lesson 3: your reputation is not what you think about yourself, it is what others experience when they deal with you. One of the most seductive lies that weak men tell themselves is that they know who they really are, and that this interior knowledge is what matters. They tell themselves that their intentions are good, that they are decent people beneath the surface, that if others don't see this, it is because others lack perception or fairness. They spend enormous energy defending this internal self-image while doing nothing to change the external reality that has generated a completely different impression in the minds of everyone around them. Your reputation is not your intentions. Your reputation is the accumulated experience of everyone who has ever dealt with you. It is built not from what you meant to do, but from what you did. Not from how you saw yourself, but from how consistently you behaved when tested. Machiavelli was relentless on this point. A prince must appear, to those who see and hear him, to be all mercy, all faith, all integrity, all kindness, all religion, and there is nothing more necessary than to appear to have this quality. But he must also understand that appearing and being are two different things, and that the world judges on appearances because appearances are what are actually visible. Most people invert this. They are so busy maintaining their internal narrative, the story they tell themselves about who they are, that they neglect entirely what they are actually broadcasting to the world. The man who thinks of himself as confident but speaks in a voice that trails into questions. The man who thinks of himself as strong but visibly flinches at criticism. The man who thinks of himself as a leader but constantly defers to whoever speaks loudest in the room. What matters is not what he knows about himself in the privacy of his own mind. What matters is what others see, and what others experience, and what reputation those experiences create. Destroying your weak self means ruthlessly auditing the gap between who you believe yourself to be and who you actually appear to be. These are almost always further apart than anyone is comfortable admitting. Ask the people who know you best to tell you, with complete honesty, what your weaknesses look like from the outside. If you cannot do this because you are afraid of the answer, you have found your first enemy. It lives in your chest. And it is you. Lesson 4: Silence is not weakness, but most weak men use it as though it were a strategy. There is a version of silence that belongs to the powerful, the calculated silence of a man who speaks only when he has something worth saying, who does not fill every room with noise to prove he exists, who understands that a man who talks constantly is broadcasting his insecurities with every unnecessary word. Machiavelli's prince was a careful speaker. He understood that information is power, and that the man who reveals everything reveals his hand, and the man whose hand is visible can be played against. But there is another version of silence, the silence of the man who has something to say and doesn't say it because he is afraid. This silence looks identical from the outside. And it is the one that most people who call themselves quiet or reserved are actually practicing without admitting it. They stay quiet in meetings where they have ideas because they fear judgment. They stay quiet in relationships where they have needs because they fear conflict. They stay quiet when they are disrespected because they have convinced themselves that responding would make them seem small, when the truth is that staying silent in the face of disrespect is what makes you small. The Machiavellian distinction here is crucial: silence as strategy is power. Silence as avoidance is weakness. And the difference is entirely internal. It lives in the question of whether you are choosing not to speak, or whether you are being prevented from speaking by fear. One of the earliest and most important exercises in destroying your weak self is learning to tell the difference, in real time, in the actual moments when your silence is being chosen. Ask yourself, if I were not afraid, would I speak now? If the answer is yes, speak. The discomfort of speaking is temporary. The discomfort of having stayed silent accumulates over years into a posture of defeat so complete that most people never recover from it. Part 2: The war you must win before any other. The most important battlefield in any man's life is not in the boardroom, not in the negotiation, not in the relationship. It is inside his own head. Every external battle is preceded by an internal one, and the outcome of the external battle is almost always determined by the outcome of the internal one long before the external one even begins. The man who has already defeated himself before he walks into the room will be defeated in the room. The man who has already won the internal war walks into every room differently, not with arrogance, but with the quiet, unmistakable certainty of a man who has faced his own darkness and did not blink. Lesson 5: Every man has a price at which he sells his self-respect. The Machiavellian man knows his and refuses it. Everybody sells out eventually. This is the belief that most people carry without ever stating it explicitly, because to state it explicitly would require confronting how many times they have already done it themselves. The man who abandons a principle because the cost of maintaining it became too high. The man who agrees with something he knows is wrong because disagreeing would have been professionally inconvenient. The man who tolerates a situation that demeans him because leaving it would require a courage he has not yet cultivated. He tells himself he is being pragmatic. He tells himself he is picking his battles. He tells himself that real life requires compromise and that idealism is for people who have not yet been tested. And there is truth in this: selective, self-serving truth, the most dangerous kind. Real life does require flexibility. Real life does require knowing when a battle is worth fighting and when it is not. But there is a difference between strategic flexibility and the gradual, incremental erosion of your own standards until you no longer have any. Machiavelli wrote that men must be either pampered or destroyed. This is extreme language, but the underlying principle is serious. A man who makes small accommodations and compromises regularly trains himself to accommodate and compromise. He builds a habit of yielding. And the world, which is expert at reading people, recognizes this habit and applies pressure at exactly the places where it has learned pressure works. The Machiavellian code on this point is not about rigidity. It is about clarity. Know your non-negotiables with such precision that when someone approaches them you feel it immediately, before they have even fully arrived at the line. Know them not as abstract values but as specific behaviors. This is what I will not say, this is what I will not accept, this is what I will not pretend is acceptable when it is not. And this is where most men fail: enforce them. Not with aggression. Not with drama. With the calm, firm consistency of a man who knows exactly who he is and has decided to remain that person regardless of the discomfort that decision creates. Lesson 6: Emotion is information, not authorization. Use it as data, not as a directive. There is a particular vulnerability that affects intelligent, sensitive men most severely, and it is the vulnerability of being ruled by their own emotional reactions. The man who is driven by anger makes decisions that serve his anger but destroy his interests. The man driven by fear makes decisions that reduce his immediate anxiety but compound his long-term weakness. The man driven by the need for approval makes decisions that win him temporary acceptance but cost him his authenticity, and eventually his self-respect, and eventually even the acceptance he was trying to win, because people, as Machiavelli observed, respect strength and despise servility, even when they benefit from it. Emotion is real. It is not the enemy. The attempt to eliminate emotion entirely is both impossible and counterproductive. Emotion contains information that pure rational analysis misses, and the man who has cut himself off from his emotional responses loses a crucial source of intelligence about his environment and about himself. Anger tells you that something has violated your values or your boundaries. Fear tells you that something threatens your survival or your well-being. Shame tells you that your behavior has deviated from your own standards. These are valuable signals. But they are signals, not commands. The Machiavellian man develops the capacity, and it is a capacity that must be developed. It does not come naturally to anyone to receive the emotional signal, process the information it contains, and then choose his response deliberately rather than react automatically. This is what Machiavelli called virtue, not virtue in the moral sense, but the quality of decisive, disciplined, intelligent action in response to circumstance. The man who practices virtue in the face of strong emotion is extraordinarily powerful, because he operates at a level of deliberateness that most people, swept along by their own reactions, cannot match. Destroy this weakness in yourself first, and the world immediately becomes simpler. When you feel anger, pause. When you feel the pull toward immediate reaction, wait. When your emotions are telling you to speak, consider whether speaking serves your interests or merely serves your feelings. These are different things, and the confusion between them is responsible for more destroyed relationships, ruined careers, and lost opportunities than almost any other single failure of character. Lesson 7: The man who needs validation has already given his power away. Of all the weaknesses that Machiavelli catalogued in the leaders and men he observed, the need for approval was the one that he returned to most consistently because it was the one that made every other weakness worse. A man who needs to be liked will not enforce his limits when enforcing them makes him temporarily disliked. A man who needs external validation for his decisions will change those decisions when the validation doesn't come, regardless of whether the decisions were correct. A man who cannot tolerate being thought badly of will tolerate almost anything else: disrespect, exploitation, diminishment, rather than risk the disapproval that would come from pushing back. And the great irony, the one that Machiavelli understood with bitter clarity, is that the behavior designed to generate approval almost always destroys it. People are attracted to confidence, to self-possession, to the quality in a person that suggests they are operating from a clear internal center rather than constantly looking outward for calibration. When you change your opinions based on who you're talking to, people sense it even if they can't articulate it. When you agree with everything, your agreement means nothing. When you can be moved in any direction by social pressure, people stop respecting your position even when they benefit from your compliance. The destruction of this particular weakness is not about becoming indifferent to others. It is about relocating your center of gravity from outside yourself to inside yourself. It is about building your sense of who you are on foundations strong enough that disagreement and disapproval can land without shaking the building. This takes time. It takes the repeated experience of surviving disapproval, of saying the true thing, or taking the principled position, or refusing the compromise, and then living through the discomfort that follows and finding that you survived it. That you were not destroyed. That the relationship continued, or didn't, and either outcome turned out to be survivable. This is how the habit of self-validation is built, not through affirmations or self-help exercises, but through the accumulation of small, real experiences of choosing yourself over approval and discovering that the world does not end. Lesson 8. Time is the most honest measure of what a man values, and most men's time accounts tell the truth about them. Machiavelli was ruthlessly practical about resources, and time is the most finite resource any man possesses. A prince who wastes resources signals to his enemies that he is not serious, and to his allies that his commitments cannot be trusted. The same principle applies to individual men in their personal lives, though most people never apply it this way. Where you spend your time is a brutally accurate account of your real priorities, not your stated priorities, not the priorities you would claim if someone asked you, but the actual ordering of your values is demonstrated by your actual behavior. A man who says that his family is his highest priority and then consistently comes home after they are asleep has told you clearly, in the language of behavior which is the only honest language, that his family is not his highest priority. A man who says he wants to build something significant and then spends his available hours on consumption and entertainment has told you clearly that he values comfort over creation, regardless of what he tells himself or others. This lesson is not about guilt. It is about alignment. The man who destroys his weak self develops a merciless clarity about the gap between what he says he values and what he actually pursues, and then he eliminates the gap not by lowering his stated values to match his behavior, which is the weak man's solution, but by changing his behavior to match his values, which requires the kind of sustained, difficult discipline that most people find ways to avoid. He audits his time not as an accountant counting someone else's money, but as a strategist assessing a campaign. Where is my time going? What is it producing? What am I trading this finite, irreplaceable resource for? And is the trade worth it? The Machiavellian insight here is that most people's time is stolen from them not by extraordinary thieves but by ordinary ones, small habits, social obligations that feel mandatory but aren't, entertainment that offers momentary relief but leaves no residue of meaning, relationships that consume without nourishing. Identifying these thieves and eliminating them is an act of self-preservation as serious as any other. The man who cannot protect his time cannot protect anything. Part 3, The Code Made Flesh, How the Man Who Has Destroyed His Weak Self Actually Lives. Everything in the first two parts of this document has been preparation. Diagnosis. The identification of wounds and the naming of the weapons that inflicted them. But a wound that has been identified and named is not yet a wound that has been healed. Knowledge is not transformation. Understanding is not power. The man who reads every book about strength and uses none of it remains exactly as weak as the man who never read anything at all. The final part of this code is about execution, about what it actually looks like, in daily life, when a man has genuinely committed to destroying the version of himself that has been losing. Lesson 9. Adversity is not the enemy of the strong man, it is the factory that makes him. Machiavelli wrote that fortune is a woman, and it is necessary, if you want to keep her under control, to beat and strike her. This is deliberately provocative language chosen to shock, to disturb, to break through the comfortable passivity of his readers. The underlying point, stripped of its historical brutality, is this: fortune, circumstances, fate, the external conditions of your life, responds to assertion. It yields to pressure. It can be shaped by a man willing to engage with it forcefully rather than simply accept whatever it delivers. Most people relate to adversity as though it were a verdict. Something hard happens, a failure, a loss, a reversal, and they interpret it as evidence about themselves. evidence that they were wrong to try, or not good enough, or that the world is fundamentally opposed to them. And this interpretation, which feels like honest self-assessment, is actually the most dangerous form of self-sabotage, because it transforms a temporary external condition into a permanent internal conclusion. The Machiavellian man does not do this. He has read enough history, starting with Machiavelli's own, to know that almost every great man he has ever admired was rebuilt from a failure so complete that it looked, from the inside, like final destruction. Lincoln lost 8 elections before he won the presidency. Churchill was considered a political corpse before World War II made him indispensable. Machiavelli himself wrote his most enduring work from the ruins of his career, tortured and exiled and, apparently, defeated. The adversity was not the end. The adversity was the raw material. This is not motivational rhetoric. This is a strategic insight. The man who accepts adversity as a factory, who goes into difficulty looking for what it can produce in him that ease never could, gains an enormous advantage over the man who avoids difficulty or is broken by it. Every man has a version of himself that can only be accessed through pressure. The diamond is in the coal, but the coal must be subjected to enormous force before the diamond appears. Most men spend their lives avoiding the force, and then, wondering why they feel soft and purposeless and slightly ashamed of themselves in the privacy of their own minds. Stop avoiding. Turn toward. This is one of the most concrete and actionable things in this entire document. Whatever thing you have been avoiding because it is hard or uncomfortable or risky, the difficult conversation, the ambitious project, the physical discipline, the confrontation with the habit you know is destroying you, move toward it today. Not eventually. Today. The man who destroys his weak self does not do it in theory. He does it in action, one specific, difficult choice at a time, starting immediately. Lesson 10: The endgame is not victory over others, it is sovereignty over yourself. Here is where Machiavelli is most often misread, and most dangerously so. His text has been used as a justification for political manipulation, for ruthless self-interest, for the exploitation of others in the pursuit of power. And, yes, the text contains the raw material for all of this. But, the man who reads it purely as a manual for external dominance has missed the deeper architecture of what Machiavelli was actually describing. The prince who endured, in Machiavelli's analysis, was not the one who was most ruthless toward others. It was the one who had achieved the most complete mastery over himself. His emotions served his strategy rather than undermining it. His image was deliberately constructed and consistently maintained. His resources were protected and deployed with discipline. His limits were clear and enforced without drama. His time was spent on what mattered and not on what merely felt urgent. He was not subject to flattery, because he had built his sense of himself on something sturdier than the opinions of others. He was not paralyzed by adversity, because he had trained himself to see adversity as a challenge to his ingenuity rather than a verdict on his worth. This is the endgame of the Machiavellian code. Not power over other people, though that often follows as a natural consequence. Not dominance for its own sake, though a man who has mastered himself is rarely dominated by others. The endgame is sovereignty. Complete, genuine, unshakable possession of yourself, your time, your decisions, your reactions, your standards, your direction. The condition of being a man who cannot be manipulated because he has no exposed soft tissue for manipulation to grip. Who cannot be seduced by flattery because he has accurate self-knowledge that flattery cannot improve on. Who cannot be broken by adversity because he has already survived the hardest thing, the destruction of his own weak self, and found that survival was possible, and that what came after the destruction was far more substantial than what came before it. This sovereignty is not arrogance. The arrogant man is actually one of the weakest there is. His performance of superiority is a defense mechanism against an interior that cannot withstand honest assessment. The sovereign man is simply honest. He knows his strengths with precision and uses them without apology. He knows his weaknesses with equal precision and addresses them without self-pity. He does not need the room to agree with him, but he also does not need the room to disagree with him. He is not organized around the room's opinion at all. He is organized around his own clear, examined, deliberately chosen values and the behavior that expresses them. The man who arrives at this, who has genuinely done the work of destroying the weak version of himself, lesson by lesson, day by day, through the accumulation of difficult choices made honestly, is almost unassailable. Not because he is physically strong, or wealthy, or powerful in the conventional sense. He may be none of those things. He is almost unassailable because there is nothing in him that fear can grip. The man who is afraid of losing his reputation has given his enemies a weapon. The man who does not derive his identity from his reputation cannot be attacked through it. The man who is afraid of confrontation can be managed by anyone willing to make things uncomfortable. The man who has made his peace with discomfort cannot be managed that way. The man who needs approval can be controlled by whoever controls the approval. The man who generates his own sense of worth from within is immune to that entire category of manipulation. This is what Machiavelli was building toward, not a theory of cruelty, not a manual for exploitation, but a portrait of the man who has made himself strong enough that the world's various mechanisms of control simply slide off him. He is too honest with himself to be deceived. He is too self-sufficient to be desperate. He is too clear about his values to be manipulated through his ambitions. He is too comfortable with adversity to be intimidated by the threat of it. He is, in the truest possible sense, free, not free from difficulty or loss or pain, because those come for everyone regardless, but free in his response to them. Free to choose how he meets what the world sends him. Free to remain himself under pressure. Free to build the life he has chosen rather than endure the life that circumstances have assigned him. There is one final thing that must be said, and it is the hardest thing in this entire document, which is why it comes last. The destruction of your weak self is not an event. It is not a decision you make once and, then, return to your life transformed. It is a practice, daily, ongoing, frequently uncomfortable, occasionally painful, never quite finished. Because the weak self does not die. He is not defeated permanently. He retreats and reorganizes and returns, sometimes in the middle of the night when you are tired and alone and your defenses are low, sometimes in the middle of the meeting or the argument or the moment of decision when the temptation to yield is strongest. He will be back. He is always back. The sovereign man does not pretend otherwise. He does not claim to have graduated from the work. He simply maintains it, checking in, auditing, asking the hard questions regularly rather than waiting for a crisis to make them unavoidable. He treats the cultivation of his character not as a project with a completion date but as a practice with a daily requirement, like physical training or the maintenance of a craft. He understands that the man he wants to be is not a destination he arrives at and inhabits permanently, but a standard he holds himself to repeatedly and deliberately in the actual conditions of his actual life. Machiavelli wrote from exile, from defeat, from the ruins of everything he had built. And, yet the document he produced from that ruin has outlasted the rulers he wrote about, the governments he served, the entire political world he inhabited. Because what he was writing, underneath the historical specificity, was a guide to the one thing that does not change, the challenge that faces every man who has ever lived, which is the challenge of becoming, through his own deliberate effort, more than the version of himself that circumstance and weakness and fear would otherwise produce. That challenge does not expire. It does not get easier with age or wealth or success. In some ways it gets harder, because the rationalizations available to an accomplished man are more sophisticated than those available to a struggling one. The work remains. The practice continues. The man who understands this, who accepts it without resentment, who sees it not as a burden but as the fundamental condition of a life lived at full capacity, is the man who has internalized the deepest lesson of the Machiavellian code. He does not need to be destroyed by others. He has already done that work himself. And what he has built in the place of what was destroyed is something that the world's various forces of manipulation, seduction, flattery, and fear are simply not equipped to touch. Begin today. Begin with the most uncomfortable truth on the list. Begin with the lesson you most wanted to argue with, because that resistance is the most accurate pointer toward where the work is needed. Begin, and do not stop, and understand that the man you are building is worth every difficult moment of the construction. The work is the reward. The becoming is the destination. And the man who destroys his weak self first, that man can never be destroyed by anyone else.